We're beginning Chapter 3, No Sniggering Around. If people with careers to think about were being pressured into keeping silent about something as serious as an assassination attempt on the president, what else might authorities be covering up? Try almost anything, and then delete almost. When we began interviewing eyewitnesses to Mohomed Atta's sojourn in Florida, what historians call primary sources, we were soon in the midst of a major anomaly in the official story. There was a problem in the FBI's timeline about when Atta first arrived in the U.S. to set up his terrorist HQ. The FBI states Mohomed Atta landed in America on June 3, 2000. We interviewed a good dozen credible eyewitnesses who could tell them they were wrong. They didn't know. Didn't they know that? They did. The logic is inescapable. If we knew it, we had to figure that they knew it as well. After all, they had a massive 4,000-man investigation team. They could put 3,999 more investigators on the street than we could. They interviewed the same people we did and heard the same things we heard. So the FBI was not wrong on Atta's timeline by accident. They were not making what could be considered honest mistakes. They were lying. Things were worse than we'd imagined. How much worse became clear when we began to compare the truth as we found it with the official story of Atta's activities and movements. From a number of sources, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, we compiled the reported milestones in the FBI's chronology of Atta's time in the U.S. Let's start with the official story as recounted in Time magazine, October 8, 2001. On June 3, 2000, he, Atta, arrived in Newark, New Jersey from Prague with a 6-month tourist visa. Within a month, Atta and al-Shehi signed up for flight training at Huffman Aviation International in Venice, Florida. That's simple enough. What the FBI says happened next was reported in the September 23, 2001 Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel. South Florida became Atta's home for almost 14 months. Al-Shehi traveled with him. They lived in Nokomis, next to Venice, a southwest Florida suburb. As they learned to fly small airplanes at Huffman Aviation from July to November 2000, that December, they apparently moved to southeast Florida as Atta shelled out about $1,500 for him and al-Shehi to gain 6 hours in a jet simulator at Sim Center in Opa-locka. Okay, we think we've got the FBI story, which goes like this. Atta arrives in the U.S. in early June, begins flight training at Huffman in Venice in July, then leaves Venice in December and moves gratefully on to the jazzier precincts of the Miami area. It is a simple, straightforward timeline. Just for safety's sake, let's hear it one more time. In the sworn testimony of Huffman Aviation's Rudy Deckers, the colorful and controversial Dutch national whose numerous post-9/11 TV appearances made him a minor celebrity. Before the House Judiciary Committee, on July 1, 2000, Deckers testified, reading from a prepared statement. Mohomed Atta and Marwan al-Shehi arrived at Huffman Aviation in Venice, Florida, to inquire about taking flying lessons. After a description was given about our flying school, they said they would let us know what they would decide about the flying lessons. On July 3, 2000, Atta and al-Shehi came back to Huffman Aviation to sign up for lessons, said Deckers. On December 24, 2000, Atta and al-Shehi rented a Warrior from Huffman Aviation for a flight. 1 to 2 days later, Atta and al-Shehi returned to Huffman Aviation to make final payments on their outstanding bills. Because they were not taking any more flying lessons, they were asked to leave the facility due to their bad attitudes and not being liked by staff and clients alike. Huffman never heard about or from them again. The official story we can say with confidence is that after getting their pilot license, Mohomed Atta and Marwan al-Shehi left Venice forever by Christmas of the year 2000. In the remaining 8 months and 11 days before the attack, the FBI's chronology leans heavily, though not exclusively, on Miami area locations. Atta is living in an apartment in Hollywood, and then another in Coral Springs. He abandons a stalled private plane on a runway in Miami, purchases global positioning devices in Fort Lauderdale, trains on a sophisticated full-motion simulator in Opa-locka. He rents single-engine planes in Belglade at the Palm Beach County Airport and in Gwinnett County, Georgia. He consults a pharmacist in Delray Beach, hangs out at Shuckham's Raw Bar in Hollywood, gets a traffic ticket in Broward County, and has frequent meetings in Paterson, New Jersey. He flies commercial from Fort Lauderdale to Boston, from Boston to New York to Prague, back to New York, from Newark to Fort Lauderdale, then to Madrid from Miami, to Las Vegas and back. While far from comprehensive, this rundown clearly illustrates the official story about Atta, which is that after December 2000, he is never in Venice. When the FBI speaks of him, the word Venice does not pass their lips. 2 weeks after the attack, the FBI released photographs and brief bios of the hijackers, along with a request for the public's assistance in obtaining more information about these individuals. Their bio on Atta omits any reference to Venice. Mohomed Atta, possible Egyptian national, date of birth used September 1st, 1968, possible residence in Hollywood, Florida, Coral Springs, Florida, and Hamburg, Germany, believed to be a pilot. This is beyond strange. The 6 months Atta was in Venice comprises roughly half of the time he was in the U.S., according to the FBI's own calculations. Yet there's no mention of Venice in his official FBI bio. If you saw Atta in a supermarket in Fort Lauderdale, the FBI would like to hear from you, since they list Atta living in Hollywood and Coral Springs residences. But if you were calling the FBI with a hot tip on seeing Atta huddled in conference with somebody in Venice, apparently they already knew all they needed to know about that. Thanks. The FBI's attempt at misdirection is obvious. This is a big clue that whatever they're covering up about Venice is big enough for them to doctor Atta's entire story to hide it. All the FBI would have to do to learn that their chronology, the basic tool of investigators, was off by miles, would have been to talk to some witnesses in Venice, as we did, or even just read the local newspapers, because the local newspapers of record in Venice and environs had simply done their job and reported what credible eyewitnesses told them about their encounters with the terrorists. They didn't know that they were in areas deemed sensitive. They were like the fire chief on Longboat Key, who blurted out what he'd seen because he wasn't clued in enough to keep his mouth shut. They were local, thank God. By interviewing dozens of eyewitnesses, often before the FBI got to them, these newspapers performed an invaluable public service. They reported the eyewitness testimony of people who had first-hand knowledge about Mohomed Atta and his terrorist cadre. For that, future historians will be grateful, even as we are. Worse for the FBI, these witnesses' stories corroborate each other in ways that definitely give them the ring of truth. Unwittingly, local people saw things that gave them possession of what's been called inconvenient knowledge. What is inconvenient knowledge? Here's a quick example. If you had been in Dealey Plaza when Kennedy was shot and happened to notice Lee Harvey Oswald standing right beside you on the curb, chomping on a chili dog while the motorcade went by, you would have seen something tremendously inconvenient. Even if you didn't want it, you would have inconvenient knowledge. Just seeing something, though, only constitutes a possession. What they treat far more seriously is seeing something and then talking to, say, a reporter. This is possession with intent to distribute, a more serious crime. Under certain circumstances, it can occasionally prove physically harmful. But consider this. If your inconvenient knowledge contains information hot enough to affect the destiny of the world, you could be in trouble even if you don't talk. Because how do they know you won't someday snigger inappropriately at the mention of Lee Harvey Oswald and drop a hint, something like, "That Oswald boy sure does love his chili dog." At a bare minimum, you would find it necessary to refrain at all costs from ever mentioning the name Oswald in a sentence containing the words chili dog. But inconvenient knowledge is nothing to make jokes about. Just ask those already in our story who unwittingly came into possession of some. Life can change real fast, and Zain Labin Omir and his buddy Hakim, wherever they are, undoubtedly understand things can happen. When Mohomed Atta and his sidekick Marwan came to Venice, they first lived with a Huffman Aviation employee named Charlie Voss. They needed some place to stay when they got into town, Voss told reporters. Later, flight school owner Rudy Deckers testified to Congress that he gave the terrorist duo Charlie's number, an act of kindness for which Charlie apparently still holds a grudge. Voss gave a stilted statement to reporters on his doorstep on the day after the attack. That sounds like something a Justice Department attorney wrote down for him and made him repeat until he had it memorized. The FBI agents informed me there were two individuals that might have crossed our paths who were students at Huffman Aviation. My employer and the FBI told me they were involved in yesterday's tragedy, Voss said. The two individuals who might have crossed Charlie's path, Atta and Marwan, lived with Voss for just a week and quickly wore out their welcome. They were asked to move when the Vosses grew tired of remarks they were making with Charlie's wife, Drusilla, characterized as arrogant and sarcastic. The ringleader, Atta, he creeped me out, Drusilla told reporters. I made them leave. Atta and Al-Shehi then signed a 6-month lease with Steve Kona, a member of the Venice Fire Department, renting a small 2-bedroom house on Laurel Drive in Nokomis, just north of Venice, where they lived from July through December 2000. Since the attack, the house has become something of a tourist attraction. To avoid any identification with the hijackers who once lived there, the current occupants have an American flag flying outside all day, every day. In an interview 6 months after the attack, landlord Kona told us, "I just maintained the grass over there in the summer. They actually dealt with the rental agency for the rent each month. But I would see them occasionally when I was over there mowing." Like many who knew them, Kona spoke of liking the bear-like Marwan, often described as being friendly and accessible. Actually, Atta kept a kind of secluded. His cousin, I talked to him a couple of times. He was friendly, but Mohomed Atta, no. I never spoke with him the 6 months he was here. Kona was clear about the time period during which Atta and Marwan had rented from him, the same July through December time period when they are said to have been at Huffman Aviation. They rented it just for that 6 months. About the same amount of time they were here for their pilot's training, and they left, Kona said. According to the FBI, that's just about the whole Venice story. A week with the Vosses, then 6 months in a pink 2-bedroom house in Nokomis. Over and out. On to Miami, right? Not so fast. Charlie Voss and Steve Kona were not Mohomed Atta's only two landlords in Venice. The terrorist had a third landlord as well, and when this individual stepped forward, alarm bells must have gone off all over FBI headquarters in Washington. Start off with this account in the Venice Gondolier 3 days after the attack. Headlined, Flight School may have charged suspected terrorists extra rent. The gist of the account was that Huffman Aviation had rented an apartment for $550 a month, and then turned around and sublet it to students at an outrageously high markup. It was hard to muster indignation over the terrorists being victimized of rent gouging, but the story also contained information which matter-of-factly destroys pretty much the entire edifice of the FBI's official story. 2 men suspected of terrorizing the heart of America this week resided in a Venice apartment earlier this year, said the paper. While attending flight school at Huffman Aviation in Venice, Mohomed Atta, 33, and Marwan al-Shehi, 23, lived with 4 other Middle Eastern students near Venice Airport at Sandpiper Apartments. The 6 Middle Eastern men shared a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment in Unit 26, said Charles Grappentine, manager of the apartments. Atta had a third landlord in Venice. That same day, the Charlotte Sun-Herald reported essentially the same thing. This was one landlord too many for the FBI's official story, and it had the same basic effect on the FBI that reports of a second gunman had 40 years earlier. But alas, for the official story, the FBI, there was a list of witnesses, an inconveniently long one, who knew firsthand that the terrorist ringleader had lived at the Sandpiper Apartments. For one, there's Amanda herself. After we'd located her, I found the Sandpiper, she told us. She met Charlie, though he was really nice. Mohomed used a check to pay for it. The name on the check was Mohomed Arjaki. The name he said was his. The FBI told me they found bank accounts of his all over under numerous different names. Then there was a couple that managed the Sandpiper Apartments, Charlie Grappentine and his wife Paula. Never had any doubt who their tenant had been. When she saw it on TV, Paula immediately recognized Atta, said the gondolier. Paula Grappentine immediately recognized the face of a suspected terrorist who may have trained for the World Trade Center attacks at Huffman Aviation in Venice. He was her next door neighbor. They lived at the Sandpiper Apartments, Unit 26 in Venice, until earlier this year. Even the postman confirms the identification, as did the tenants next door to Atta and Amanda's apartments. None doubted that the terrorist ringleader had been in their midst. As it turns out, Mohomed and Amanda had been anything but an inconspicuous duo. Atta lived at the Sandpiper earlier this year, reported the gondolier, meaning, of course, earlier than September 14, 2001, date of the story. Maybe you see the problem. At the time, these eyewitnesses say Atta was at the Sandpiper. The FBI says he was no longer in Venice. The Grappentines and the other Sandpiper apartment eyewitnesses were about to discover the consequences of possessing inconvenient knowledge. Although at least 2 other newspapers covered the story, reporter Earl Kimmel made it his own in the Sarasota Herald Tribune, owned by the New York Times. In the aftermath of 9/11, Kimmel had understandably focused on the local angle. The terrorists in Venice was a huge story for a sleepy little town. If it hadn't been so heartbreakingly tragic, it might have felt like Christmas to reporters there. As Venice was discovered to be increasingly important to the story of the terrorist conspiracy, the headlines over the paper's reports changed to reflect it, going from FBI links third terrorist to Venice to fourth terrorist suspect may have ties to Venice, to Fifth pilot trainee vanishes. How about that? In his initial account of Atta's third Venice landlords, Kimmel recapped what the FBI had released about Atta's stay in Venice, and right away he noticed a huge discrepancy between local eyewitnesses and the official account. Voss and his wife, Drew, asked the pair to leave after less than a week. The two men lived in a Nokomis rental home from July 2000 to January 2001. According to the home's owner, Huffman flight instructors have said they believe Atta left the area shortly after receiving his pilot certification. However, Atta may have been in Venice as recently as April. Charles Grappentine, the manager of Sandpiper Apartments on Airport Avenue in Venice, said he remembers seeing Atta at the complex for about 3 weeks in April. He said Atta was living in the apartment of Amanda Keller. When we finally found Amanda Keller, one of the first things she said was how distressed she had been when she learned that her former landlord had talked to the press. When I saw Charlie talking in the newspaper, I knew they were going to jump all over him. I thought, Charlie, no, can't you just wait? Kimmel's story was where we first learned that terrorist ringleader Atta had an American girlfriend while in Venice. Somewhere out there was a girl named Amanda Keller, who undoubtedly had one whale of a story to tell. News accounts of Atta's stay at the Sandpiper don't just stray from the FBI account, they flatly contradict it. After just weeks in Southwest Florida, we had the chilling feeling that someone or something big was hidden down in the mangrove swamps of Southwest Florida. Something in Venice. When we showed up at the Sandpiper Apartments over 6 months after the attack, we learned we were in luck. The shock had begun to wear off, and the FBI agents had stopped coming around. After climbing the stairs to Unit 26, Atta and Amanda's second floor apartment, we knocked on their next-door neighbor's door. Stephanie Fredrickson was home. She invited us in, and she talked. And yeah, that's it for chapter 3.